A fiery experience. As Brooke was sleeping a perfect and dreamless sleep in a city more than a considerable distance away, and in another hemisphere, young Bridie Winkler was herself waking by way of blinking her blurred eyes open. She wanted to wake, but it would seem that the blissful, though common state that was sleep was battling for her attention this very early morn. The sun had not risen yet. In fact, it was the loss of her second blanket during the night which caused her to stir before her due time, thus resulting in her current conundrum of sleeping or waking. A chill was creeping under her skin, and a tiny little smile had budded on her lips. A cheery start to the day began, because Bridie could feel that it would be a cold day, the best kind of day that there ever could be. This delighted her, because it meant she could stoke the first fire of winter, and it took her no hesitation at all, despite the cold, to tear off her cover, sit up and place her feet on the cold wood floor. She looked at the clock and knew everyone in the house was still asleep, and it was so quiet that you could hear a mouse squeak. She rubbed her arms and shook her head, causing a mass of long red curls to fall in her eyes, and she brushed them out of her eyes as she looked around the room for her slippers. While still sitting on her bed, she held her curls out of her eyes, and when she could not spot them, she bent over the side of the bed and looked both between her feet and under the bed for the elusive slippers. Aha! There you are! She reached underneath the bed and pulled them out and placed them on, not caring that they were on the wrong feet, and then she raced over to her door, put on her dressing gown as quickly as possible, and raced out of her room, down the passageway, and through to where the back door was being sure to make only the lightest of pitter-patters on the wooden boards. Bridie unlocked the door as quick as the wind and pulled it open with such reckless abandon, she almost fell out of it and into the snow, which was forming a small mound on the doorstep. She gained composure quickly and managed not to fall, but took an enormous step over the small snowy mound and into the backyard. The snow was not yet thick enough on the ground to cause any difficulty with her quick movements, as it was just forming the sheerest veneer of sleet, and therefore causing only the very occasional problem of a wobbly slide. This did not bother the girl in the slightest, for she was adept at foiling the trickeries of this wintry back step, for it was where she had taken her very first steps, in this very spot outside of the home's back door. It was instinct and not conscious memory that kept Bridie upright this morning, because all that mattered to Bridie was that, on this first day of winter, was that she wanted to be the first one that started the log fire in the family lounge room. Even though this was only the second year of doing such a thing, Bridie had decided that this was a ritual that she would be partaking in for a very long time, and that she would be the first of many generations that would birth a fire whisperer who would love this tradition as much as she herself did. Bridie completed the short walk down to the woodshed and cleared the small lump of snow that had piled itself into a spot of inconvenience by the shed door, and she opened the door to look around with a decided air of sternness about her. The first log of wood for the year would be an important one, and it had to be the right one to her mind. And it had to have the right feel, too. She had to feel good about it. So, she entered the woodshed and studied every piece of wood meticulously. She had made it a point to learn all about the properties of what makes an excellent piece of firewood a brilliant piece of firewood, and now would be her opportunity to put her newfound learning to the test this morning. She would surprise her family before they woke up with some fiery, cozy comfort, and if she got the fire going before they woke up, she had prepared a breakfast of tea and toast also. But first things first, let's build a fire! With excitement and quiet anticipation, she whispered to herself. The girl wanted to make sure that the log was the right colour, but this was for her own personal satisfaction, for she thought to herself that colour would have no effect on how well a fire burnt, but it just satisfied her nature to have such things satisfied. Bridie put her more whimsical side aside and decided that on a more serious note, the wood would have to be the correct length, and that it would not be too damp, that it had low moisture density, or it wasn't too old, and not only that, but it had also great structural density too, and one that she just simply felt good about it. She tapped her forefinger against her lips and narrowed her eyes as she looked about. intense and meticulous, in her study, and then, after what felt like eternity, she exhaled. None of the logs met her aesthetic standards, which disappointed her slightly. Additionally, they were all slightly damp because of her father's forgetfulness. This made them brittle and further added to her dissatisfaction. She also noticed that they had been sitting there for too long. Even the colour of the wood seemed a little darker than she would have liked, and gave herself a little note to scold her father about the whole darn mess after breakfast. "Oh, what to do? What? To? Do?" Bridie exclaimed, tapping her foot now in her lips. Bridie thought for a moment, and just as she was shutting her eyes to contemplate her conundrum and snort in derision, she sniffed, and then sniffed again, and very quickly sniffed again. "Ooh, smoke!" And Bridie turned on her heels, still sniffing the air, and her eyes widened as she saw a perfect little dark wood log, exactly as she would have imagined her perfect log to be just sitting on top of a small wood pile, with a very small flame flickering at its southern tip. I... The girl pulled in her chin, trying to gather her wits. "What in the world?" Bridie's mouth slammed shut mid-sentence, as a voice very softly spoke from a tiny little flame. "I wanted to be a surprise for you, Bridie. I hid myself so I could surprise you." The flame spoke with glee. Bridie blinked, causing her eyes to widen. She couldn't see a face in the flame, but she felt like the voice came from it. "I hope that it is a joyous surprise for you, friend." The voice cackled with glee. Well, Bridie was not entirely sure what she was thinking, but she knew for certain that she was surprised. Her voice trailed off because of pensive thoughts, and after a moment she gathered herself and spoke with deliberate and slow caution. "I guess that I am surprised." Speaking out, this revelation seemed to fill her with confidence, and she boldly exclaimed, Yes, I am surprised. How on earth did you come alive, and how on earth are you speaking?" Bridie leaned in to inspect the flame. Her natural curiosity was overriding everything else that she was feeling. "It isn't really on earth that I came to be." Bridie, even more intensely, continued her inspection. The flame looked like any other ordinary little flame, except maybe being a little brighter and a little warmer than any ordinary flame. She could still not understand where the voice of the flame was coming from because it seemed to have no mouth. It sounded like the voice was coming from within the flame. In fact, there was absolutely nothing about this log of wood and flame that looked like anything out of the ordinary. And so her internal bafflement continued, but she refused to show it in her outward demeanour. Bridie stared at the flame. "How on earth? Is just an expression, you know, flame. Did you really come from somewhere else? Because I certainly didn't see you when I was inspecting the wood just now. I would have noticed you because you look so perfect. Did you come out of hiding just for me?" Yes, I did, girl. I did. Just for you." The little flame spoke almost in a crackling whisper. The flame's voice reminded her of a gentle and kind wicked witch, if there was ever such a thing, Bridie thought to herself, because I have seen and heard it with my very own eyes and ears. "I have so many questions that I don't know where to start, Flame." Bridie spoke back in a soft whisper. "My mind is full of questions. Well, my first question would be, am I dreaming?" The girl was speaking to herself more than she was the flame at this point. Nope, I am not dreaming. It is the first day of winter, and I know that because I have been counting down the days since summer. Also, I would have made myself have a much better dream than this one, that is for sure, or maybe this was the best dream ever." There was nothing else to it, so Bridie pinched herself, and sure enough, she found herself awake. This was proven to be a tried-and-true test to her mind, and so it was decided. "No, I'm not dreaming. I'm very much awake." Bridie nodded her head decisively. "So then, Flame, what are you doing here?" "First things first, Bridie, my girl. You better get me inside and onto the fire. Your family will be awake soon, and we better get that first fire of winter lit. Take me inside." Without another word, Bridie, wondering how the flame knew about her first winter's fire, picked up the piece of wood and another small piece or two, and made her way back into the house as the sun was rising through the thick, grey, wintry cloud. As she stepped inside the back door and made her way through the hallway and into the lounge room, not a single living thing stirred as she got the first wood fire of winter lit. She placed the small 2 pieces of wood into the fireplace, and then placed her new friend on top of those, and watched with interest as the flame went to work to create a gently sizzling fireplace. "We have to whisper fire," Bridie made her gentle demand, as she sat cross-legged in front of the warmth of the fire. "Now, tell me, what are you doing here and where are you from?" "There is no time to waste, girl. I have to show and not tell, whether you are ready or not. I do think you're ready. So, are you ready, girl?" Without a second's hesitation, or even waiting for a response from Bridie, the young charge felt herself being sucked into a little door that had formed inside of the small wood fire setting, and in no time at all, she sat on her bottom on a tuft of lush green grass in a very pretty valley full of sunshine and butterflies, and in the midst of little houses which stood handsomely but with no order to where each stood, forming a little village. She could also see that her feet, which sat out in front of her, still had the slippers on back to front, and she knew that she looked silly but did not care in the slightest, particularly in light of what she was witnessing. Bridie had decided that her oddly placed slippers seemed right at home here in this delightful little village. It took a moment or two for Bridie to notice that the little flame had placed itself on the ground next to her right side, and she pondered it, somehow hoping to gain answers, though knowing that she most likely would not. Bridie was unsure of what to make of these strange events for the second time that morning. So, doing the only thing that she knew to do, she pinched herself and yelped a little at the pain. "Yep, still awake and not dreaming." Turning her gaze again to the flame, Bridie again asked, "Where are we? It is a very pretty place." "We are in the place of the great wise master. He has things to show you. You have very important work to do, girl." "Important work?" Bridie spluttered and choked. "You say silly things. But I don't know why I'm surprised after all that has happened this morning. Well, go on, silly flame. Please tell me all about my important work." The log, which lay horizontal beside Bridie, stood itself upright, and 2 little branch-like legs grew out of its bottom section and on each side of the log. These 2 branch-like legs grew from itself leg-like twigs, and out of these leg-like twigs grew feet-like twigs. The flame itself positioned itself atop the now horizontal piece of wood, almost forming the shape of a head, a very fiery red head at that. Bridie still noted that the flame had no formed facial features, and it still very much resembled a burning flame, nor did it grow any arms or hands. The creature stood at the height of Bridie, all thanks, of course, to the plank of wood's newfound legs and positioning of the flame atop the wood. "I expect that you are taking me somewhere, flame?" The flame nodded and began to take clumsy and slow steps forward. It reminded Bridie of a toddler taking its first steps, except that the flame was not falling on its backside, though clearly this was not a comfortable state for the flaming log to be in. Bridie kept her pace slow to match that of her companion, but knew it was going to be a very slow walk to wherever they were headed. A couple of times, Bridie opened her mouth to speak and closed it again. She was tempted to ask to carry the log, but instinct told her to refrain, for she felt that it may be an insult. They had not walked for more than 100 meters, and the flame piped up with indignancy. "You could have offered to carry me, girl. This is going to take forever." Taken aback, Bridie opened and closed her mouth, unsure of her next words. Then she gave a snort of derision. "You could have asked me to carry you before you grew such useless legs." She eyed the apparatus beside her. "You could have grown yourself some arms and hands, and that would have balanced you well. And while we are on the subject, your legs look terribly thin. It is a surprise that you can stand at all, let alone walk." Bridie felt bad for snapping, but was determined not to let it show, and in her haughtiest voice spoke, "Well, let me pick you up then, but you have to put yourself back to your normal state." Though, before the girl could even finish her sentence, the log had produced exactly as the girl had wished. A new set of legs and a pair of solid feet and arms and hands, all made from sticks and twigs, and all in perfect proportion to the log. Lesson 1 learnt, my girl. Controlling what you actually feel and calling out what needs to happen. Well done, child. You are well advanced for your years, young'un. Is everything going to be a test? Anyway, why am I being tested? Bridie put her nose in the air before retorting. I am not thrilled about being tested, especially against my knowledge. And with incredulousness continued, I did not know that I was even in class, and I am most unhappy about it all. The log began to walk, this time at a suitable and sustainable pace. You have work to do and little time to learn how to do it, girl, was the flame's patient response. Bridie's mouth twisted. I really don't know what that means. Fire, you keep refusing to tell me. Before the fiery log could say anything, the pair had almost bumped into a large sandstone brick wall that appeared in front of them, taking them both by surprise. Well, that came out of nowhere, exclaimed Bridie. Indeed, lesson 2 for you, young'un. Learn to never be surprised that you will always be surprised. When you learn this lesson, then nothing will ever alarm you, and you will always be on alert and at the top of your game. It will keep you from trickery. The flame, sensing the girl's state of flummox, spoke again. Well, that is enough lessons for you today. You've done well, my girl. Bridie sighed a little sigh of relief, especially at the silliness of the so-called second lesson. Her head was hurting a little as she tried to grasp the second lesson, but decided that she would think all about it later on. So, Flame, where did this wall come from? This is a wall that will take us to see Naeme. Flame began to tap at the wall to try to find the secret door. This only took a moment, and a door opened, which the pair entered into the exact same place that they had just left. This is exactly the same place. Why on earth would we enter a door to end up in exactly the same place? Queried the girl. Entering through the door via the way of that wall makes us covered and invisible to anyone who would try to find us. It is like a big invisible shield, you see. Flame paused. Your response is a very good example of why lesson 2 is so important. For what mad reason would we need to hide? Bridie asked, ignoring the latter half of Flame's statement. There is a fight coming, you see, and I believe that you will be the first to start it. I will what? I am not starting any fight. There is a firestorm upon us, Bridie. A voice that Bridie had never heard before spoke. Bridie swung on her heels at the sound of a deep but gentle voice. A comely, kind-looking man stood before her. Bridie said nothing but blinked and continued to stare at him wide-eyed as if nothing else she was curious. A firestorm? Bridie herself could not figure out whether she was asking a question or making an exclamation. There is a fire burning in the east, Bridie, way, way in the distance. And this is not a good thing at all, but a very, very bad thing. These parts have not seen such a fire burn for a very long time in Alasia. Well, that sounds horrible not to ever have a fire burn for so long. How incredibly sad. The wood burning next to her recoiled in dismay, horrified at such a thought. Naeme's eyes sparkled a little. Don't worry, we have had plenty of fires. Do not fear that. It is this particular fire that we have not had here in longer than anyone cares to remember, and we would prefer not to have it now. Naeme studied the girl, who was looking up at him with wide-eyed curiosity, deciding that she looked hungry. Are you hungry? We have lots of sandwiches and cakes and sausage rolls. Would you like some? Bridie's eyes grew wider at the prospect, if that was possible. She had the idea of making her family breakfast that morning, but knew that this was probably not going to happen now, plus they could feed themselves, and she was feeling a little more than a bit hungry. So, she better eat while she had the chance, and her mouth watered at the thought of all the delights. She followed Naeme to a large hut with the fiery wood, walking right beside her. Standing before her was a big canteen-style construction with a wide opening but no door. It had 3 walls, each wall containing benches and stovetops and sinks and ovens, refrigerators and freezers, and in the middle of the hut stood the longest table that she had ever seen, and it was laden with delights. Wafting from the large hut came the smell of hot strawberries and sugar, which were simmering away on a very large stove top. She supposed it to be a jam in the making, and hopefully for fresh doughnuts. The scent of fresh pastries wafted through the air, mingling with the aroma of cinnamon doughnuts. Ah! She sighed with an open mouth, quite akin to drooling, and fortunately she caught herself before she lost her drool out of the corners of her mouth, and she felt a little red-faced at the prospect of it. Standing over the benches that lined the walls of the hut were small and fat little men and women, all dressed in chef's attire of all colours, and she wondered if they just liked to wear bright colours, or the colours meant something. She decided that it was all personal choice, but she did not quite believe herself. All 10 of them were what would be considered stoutly, but in reality were fat, sang and talked and nattered amongst themselves as they stirred the pots, rolled the pastry, washed the dishes, and served the food onto a long and large wooden table. The table was absolutely laden with delicacies of all kinds, though, mainly the sweet kind. Big clear jugs of different cold-coloured liquid sat interspersed throughout, as did piping hot jugs of coffee and tea. This could be Bridie's opportunity to have her first ever cup of coffee, and to have it with a jam donut was almost too much for her to resist. She looked over at Naeme, who had now positioned himself in a rocking chair. Naeme's eyes twinkled as he observed a look of almost desperation on her face, looked at the table and then at Bridie, and then nodded. Her well-coiffed manners were the only thing stopping the girl from running to the table and positioning herself right over the top of the table and gorging herself. She wanted nothing more than to stuff her face with more food than she could handle, and let the crumbs and her spittle spray the table as she gorged herself. But of course, Bridie Winkler politely picked up a grey clay plate and scoured the table, and deciding upon a coveted doughnut and a sandwich, she placed it on her plate. Then, feeling red-faced with guilt at her wilful agreement to her own indulgence, and knowing her wilful disobedience to parent constraints regarding the consumption of caffeine, Bridie guiltily also poured herself a cup of coffee. A very ordinary wooden chair sat at the table, and she took no time to sit down, as she had only one thing on her mind, and that was to savour her first ever taste of coffee, and just as she was inhaling it and bringing it to her lips, she was startled by a voice, which shocked her out of her blissful comfort. "Is that all you're eating?" The hot coffee spilled on her hands and onto her lap, and droplets spilled over the sandwich and doughnut. She put the coffee down to clean herself up. A voice bellowed beside her, "You're going to need a lot more than that. Here, let me fill up your plate." A boy, who appeared a little older than her, grabbed her plate away, not even being remotely aware of the raucous he caused. Then, before she could protest, he had piled it up with all sorts of goodies until it looked like a little mountain, baked goods, and nothing but the rim of her plate could be seen. "There you go, that's better." "There is absolutely no way I could eat all of that." "No, probably not, but you can wrap it up and take it with you." "Take it with me? Where?" "You're going over to the fire in the east, aren't you?" "I am." "Well, a few of us wanted to go, but we don't have the call of the fire like you have." In that moment, Bridie had noticed that the flame was not by her side anymore. She had been so transfixed by the banquet before her, and allured by the coffee, she had completely forgotten that she had a companion. Bridie lifted herself up by way of gripping the arms of her chair and flung her around in desperate anticipation of locating her missing flame. The result was the uncomfortable feeling of whiplash. The flame was nowhere to be seen, and an infinitesimal moment of panic gripped her. To appease her momentary panic, she pushed her chair back and raced to the entrance of the annex, her eyes scanning to and fro. I could see the flame in discussion with what looked to be a cloud, which too stood horizontally upright, though this cloud seemed to hover above the ground and did not possess self-made legs like her log of wood did. The cloud was varying shades of lilac and lavender and other similar sorts that swirled and whirled and melded in together. The cloud itself was a moving object, even as it stood in one spot with its colours gyrating, as though it fancied itself to be a lantern without the benefit of throwing off rays of light or colour. Such was the intensity between them that Bridie thought it better not to interrupt the duo, but just observe them, which she did with curiosity. Bridie noted that at some points during their interactions, the fire flickered and grew almost triple in its short bursts of intensity, and the flame grew with a fiery redness of colour as it did so. At other moments within their interjections, the cloud, too, had its own responses with quick and reverberated movements. The cloud's pillowy countenance and lilac hues became overly bright and blinding, and the colours almost looked fiery and angry as it did so within its own moments of intenseness. The cloud and the flame appeared to be communicating with one another without any verbal interactions. She did not think that either the fire or cloud looked angry or upset with each other, but she could not be completely sure. Over yonder, and far beyond the intense gaze of Bridie, which remained on the unlikely pair before her, was the pillar of smoke. The changes which were occurring with the pillar of smoke escaped the observance of all the townsfolk, including Naeme himself, who sat resting in the same chair he first sat in, now with his eyes closed and a smile on his lips. He would always find comfort in the sounds and the joy of the townfolk. It gave his soul rest. Naeme listened as the cooks kept cooking and the diners kept eating and talking and laughing with raucousness, as the cloud of smoke changed from a consistent, steady stream of smoke of faint, pale grey, barely visible in the distance, to changing into furnace-like black billows which shot out of the ground every 3 seconds.